I get it, they're idiots, I better they fed him. We dare them, the police got wedding, is in a wedding is Southern Cross. Flame, we dead him. The police go wedding is in a wedding is in a wedding is flame, we dead him.
Philip Simpson does not merely have a defense. He possesses a catastrophic arsenal of evidence that mathematically destroys the state's entire narrative.
Love this land, my station brings handstand. Beauty a match, war, life has patched that. Fuck you, fuck the gov, corrupt the child, dove above. Cops, criminals, animals, sinners, spins.
Hey everyone, welcome. I'm absolutely thrilled you're tuning in for this explainer today. We are unpacking a piece of history that plays out honestly like a gripping Bushrangers documentary. We're going to explore how a rough-and-tumble group of Australian outlaws not only shaped an entire nation's cinematic identity, but also inadvertently caused its spectacular downfall. It's a crazy tale of rebellion, innovation, and some really heavy-handed censorship, all wrapped up in the very birth of the silver screen. So, how did a gang of 19th century outlaws accidentally destroy the most successful film industry in the world? It sounds literally impossible, right? But it's true. Way before Hollywood even existed as we know it, Australia was the undeniable heavyweight champion of the global film industry. And the very thing that built that empire, the legends of the bush, eventually brought the whole thing crashing down. Let's find out exactly how that happened. Part 1. Outlaws of the Outback. The reality versus the myth. Okay, to really understand this cinema boom, we first have to understand the men who inspired it. Let's head back to the rugged Australian outback and see who these outlaws actually were before they got immortalized on film. A bushranger was basically an individual in Australia, spanning from the late 18th to the early 20th century, who lived in the bush and survived through criminal activities. Sometimes this was to escape harsh penal conditions, or sometimes just to defy authorities. They intimately knew this unforgiving landscape, and they used it to their advantage to skirt the law and entirely frustrate the colonial government. They were survivalists first and criminals second. And you know, this wasn't just a single quick wave of crime. It actually evolved over a century across 3 very distinct phases. From 1790 to 1850, it was mostly desperate convicts fleeing punitive measures. Then the gold rush hit. So between 1851 and 1870, native-born Australians took to the bush, seeking adventure and fortune. Finally, from 1870 to 1900, the motivations shifted yet again. These later bushrangers often saw themselves as political activists, actively defying perceived injustices. So who were the main characters in this real-life bushrangers documentary? Well, first we have Ben Hall. He was a mastermind who pulled off a staggering 77 kilograms gold heist, which, by the way, is worth about $10 million today. And incredibly, he did it without taking a single life. Contrast him with Dan Mad Dog Morgan, a guy known for his brutal violence and sheer insanity. And then, of course, there's Ned Kelly, the iconic, armor-wearing outlaw who became a massive anti-hero. It was exactly this friction, the romantic, clever rogue versus the terrifying, violent criminal, that totally captivated the public but absolutely terrified the government. Part 2. Birth of feature films, the silver screen boom. Flash forward to 1906. The raw, local folklore of the Outback is about to collide with a brand new flickering technology. And the result? A staggering 70-minute runtime. Now, to put that into perspective, when the story of the Kelly Gang premiered, movies were just short little novelties lasting maybe 5 to 10 minutes. This was an absolute game changer. Running between 70 and 80 minutes, it is officially recognized as the world's very first feature-length narrative film. And the financial returns? Just mind-blowing. The director, Charles Tate, and his partners spent an estimated £400 to £1,000 to make the film, but they raked in an estimated £25,000 at the box office. The film was such a massive hit that it toured for over 20 years, playing to packed houses everywhere. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that crime on screen paid incredibly well. Naturally, the success of the Kelly Gang sparked a massive production boom. Between 1900 and 1914, a staggering 116 bushranger films were produced in Australia. Just think about that. That created a booming film industry totally unprecedented in world cinema. This single genre effectively built the early Australian film industry into a global powerhouse. Part 3: The Moral Panic, Law, Order, and Censorship. But as you can imagine, as this new medium captured everyone's imagination, a massive backlash started brewing. You had this intense divide. The public view was that bushrangers are romantic, rugged, anti-authoritarian heroes, standing up to an unjust system. But the government view, well, they argued bushranger films were a glorification of outlawry that incited crime and portrayed the police as villains. The government was terrified these movies would corrupt young audiences. And this moral panic didn't just stay in the papers. It led to swift legislative action. As the quote goes, alarmed by what they saw as the glorification of outlawry, state governments imposed a ban on bushranger films, effectively removing the entire folklore relating to bushrangers from the most popular form of cultural expression. South Australia dropped the hammer first in 1911, followed closely by Victoria and New South Wales in 1912.
Part 4: The Bushranger Film Ban and a Crippled Industry.
So we enter a really oppressive chapter in 1912 with the New South Wales Theatres and Public Halls Act. The incredible irony here is that the police, the very people who were usually the bad guys in these films, were placed directly in charge of censoring them. Screening objectionable material resulted in fines up to £20. Exhibitors were furious, correctly pointing out that the police were totally biased. This triggered a catastrophic domino effect. Step 1. Local filmmakers completely avoid their most profitable genre because of the risk. Step 2. Without those flagship stories, Australian film production drastically declines. And Step 3. Australian screens are culturally colonized by imported Hollywood cowboy films. America's westerns basically replaced Australia's own historical mythology. Believe it or not, this ban crippled the industry for decades. It literally wasn't until 1942 that the ban was finally broken, when the Kellys Road was allowed to screen in New South Wales. The justification for lifting it? Well, Chief Secretary Jack Badley decided that fictionalized bushranger crimes simply paled in comparison to the unbridled horrors of war. It took World War II to make authorities realize a movie wasn't the biggest threat out there. Part 5: Resurrection of the Legend, the 1970s and beyond. With the ban finally gone, the cinematic energy bounced right back. During the 1970s film revival, radical nationalism actually used these outlaws to define an independent Australian identity. Cultural artifacts like Ned Kelly's armor and the Gerald Airy letter became absolute museum treasures. In modern cinema, we saw huge global Kelly films starring Heath Ledger in 2003 and George Mackay in 2019. And perhaps most amazingly, that original 1906 Kelly Gang film was inscribed on the UNESCO Memory of the World Register as invaluable global heritage. All of this leaves us with a really fascinating question. Where exactly do we draw the line between a dangerous historical villain and a legendary cultural hero? As we've seen in this explainer, the men who were once hunted by police became the stars of the world's first feature film, were banned by the government, and then resurrected as global icons of a nation's identity. It just goes to show how time, cinema, and storytelling completely transform how we view history. Thanks so much for joining me today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.
Welcome to part 1 of our 3-part explainer series on the gritty, historical origins of Australia's most infamous criminal movement. You know, when we think of the Australian bushranger, we almost immediately picture a guy in a homemade suit of iron armor, Ned Kelly, right? Making this last, defiant stand against the police. But that iconic image from 1880 is actually the very end of a century-long story. Today, we're going all the way back to the beginning to uncover how this entire phenomenon actually started.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the myths of the Australian bush, the brutal penal system, the first convict bolters, indigenous resistance and trackers, and finally, the dawn of organized outlaws. We are totally stripping away the romantic mythos to expose the brutal 18th century carceral state that birthed this whole survivalist movement.
Section 1. Myths of the Australian Bush. Separating legend from reality. We really need to confront the legend of the Aussie battler directly before we go any further.
Pop culture absolutely loves the romantic, rebel fighting injustice, that noble, chivalrous Robin Hood figure. But the historical reality paints a much, much darker picture. The early bushrangers were starving, desperate escapees leading incredibly nasty, brutish, and short lives. They weren't fighting for some grand political philosophy. They were literally fighting for their next meal in a completely unforgiving environment. And while the myth is overwhelmingly a white male legend popularized way later in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the actual term bushranger is incredibly old. It first popped up back in a February 1805 issue of the Sydney Gazette to describe 3 armed men who stopped a cart between Sydney and Hawkesbury. It definitely wasn't a term of endearment. It was a label for a terrifying new type of criminal who used the wild environment to their advantage.
Section 2. The brutal penal system, the cause of the crisis. To truly understand the effect of these outlaws, we have to examine the root cause.
162,000. That is the staggering number of British and Irish convicts transported to the remote penal colonies of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land between 1788 and 1852. The British Empire basically designed these remote settlements to alleviate their own overcrowded domestic prisons, so they shipped tens of thousands of people across the world into a completely unfamiliar, harsh frontier.
Just listen to the visceral desperation in these words from William Westwood, a convict who eventually led a deadly uprising. He said he was treated more like a beast than a man, until nature could bear no more. When you strip a human being of their agency, isolate them from everything they know, and subject them to extreme discipline, well, human nature eventually reaches a breaking point.
And that breaking point was driven by extreme colonial conditions. Severe food shortages meant absolute starvation was a common reality. Convicts faced arbitrary sentence extensions for the most minor infractions, like just acquiring unauthorized clothing. They endured public lashings and were forced into chain gangs to clear land and carve roads through incredibly rugged terrain. Honestly, ask yourself, faced with those horrific conditions in a remote, highly disciplined colony, wouldn't you have run into the wild bush too?
Section 3. The first convict bolters. Escaping the lash. This desperate need for survival is exactly what fueled the very first era of bushranging.
Before they were universally known as bushrangers, they were called bolters. This forms the foundation of our first era. These were men who bolted from their assigned labor or prison confines, deciding they would rather face the immense hazards of the wild, unexplored Australian bushland over the absolute deprivation and brutality of convict life. They had to rely on raw survival skills and small-scale robbery of outlying settlers just to stay alive.
And here is where the historical reality completely shatters the popular myth. The very first notable bushranger wasn't a white Australian at all. It was an African convict from the First Fleet named John Caesar, known historically as Black Caesar.
Caesar's story perfectly captures the true genesis of this movement. Transported on the First Fleet, he was a physically massive man who simply couldn't survive on the meager, starvation-level prison rations. Driven by pure, agonizing hunger, he escaped multiple times. He survived by raiding settlers' gardens and even taking food from Aboriginal camps. Eventually, he headed a gang of fellow escaped convicts before he was shot and killed by bounty hunters for a reward in 1796. He wasn't a political rebel. He was literally a starving man just trying to live.
Meanwhile, the government essentially created a monster of its own making. Over in Van Diemen's Land, which is modern-day Tasmania, authorities were facing severe crop failures in Sydney. So to prevent mass starvation, they made an astonishingly desperate move. They actually armed convicts and sent them into the bush to hunt kangaroos. But surprise, surprise, once these men tasted freedom and had weapons in their hands, they just flat out refused to return. They used those guns to raid properties and steal livestock instead, accidentally kickstarting a massive bushranging epidemic.
Section 4. Indigenous Resistance and Trackers, the Untold Frontier.
As we explore this era, we absolutely have to look at the people whose ancestors had mastered this wilderness for tens of thousands of years. Take the incredible historical figure of Mosquito, an Eora man originally from Port Jackson. His life represents a fascinating and, frankly, tragic intersection of bushranging, colonial law, and indigenous resistance.
Early in his life, Mosquito actually worked as a tracker for the colonial government, but after being betrayed and denied passage back to his home, he turned rogue. He formed a group known as the Tame Gang, made up of Aboriginal men. Forced off their traditional lands, they survived by raiding colonial farms. Mosquito was an absolute master of his environment, using brilliant guerrilla warfare tactics that made him a terrifying opponent for British soldiers. He was eventually captured and hanged in 1825 on somewhat dubious evidence. Pushed into criminality by introduced colonial laws, his tactical brilliance is a stark reminder of the highly diverse reality behind bushranger history.
And this dynamic created a deeply tragic divide on the colonial frontier.
On one side, you had Aboriginal bushrangers, pushed off their traditional lands, fighting for survival, using their deep environmental knowledge. On the flip side, British forces quickly realized they were completely outmatched in the bush, so they heavily recruited Aboriginal trackers. These trackers became the only law enforcement truly capable of navigating the wild. And tragically, they were often forced by the colonial system to hunt down both escaped convicts and their own people.
Section 5. Dawn of Organized Outlaws. Setting the stage. As the mid-19th century approached, the very nature of these outlaws began to shift. The era of the desperate, starving convict bolter was slowly coming to an end. Our focus today, the convict bolters from 1790 to 1850, is really just the foundation. These early bolters laid down the absolute blueprint for wilderness survival and anti-authoritarian defiance. But as the transportation of convicts started to decline in the 1840s, Australia's demographics were about to change forever.
Which leaves us with a massive question for part 2 of our Explainer series. How does a movement born of starvation, physical abuse, and penal chains transform when the colonies suddenly overflow with portable, easily stolen wealth? The discovery of gold in 1851 changed everything, turning desperate survivalists into native-born, heavily armed, and highly organized criminals. I seriously can't wait to uncover how that unfolds next time. See you then.
When a fugitive flees into the Australian wilderness today, the local press frequently defaults to a predictable script. They call him a modern-day Ned Kelly. Capturing a single suspect in the unforgiving bush requires massive resources. Modern manhunts deploy helicopters, tactical response groups, and fleets of highway patrol vehicles to secure the perimeter. Yet the public obsession with the outlaw persists. It was cemented over a century ago by the 1906 release of The Story of the Kelly Gang, the world's first feature-length film, which framed the bushranger as the ultimate Aussie battler fighting an unjust system. That cinematic reverence is a carefully constructed cultural fiction. It deliberately hides a historical record defined by starvation, extreme violence, and desperation. The first bushrangers were born entirely out of the British carceral state. In the early penal colonies of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, convicts faced severe food shortages, isolation, and arbitrary public lashings. Those who escaped into the dense scrub became known as convict bolters. They were not fighting for political ideals, they were fighting to survive. Stripped of resources, some, like the infamous Alexander Pierce, ultimately resorted to cannibalism to stay alive in the wilderness. This early era of bushranging also intersected directly with Indigenous resistance. Aboriginal fighters, such as the Eora man Mosquito, used their mastery of the terrain to raid colonial settlements and push back against European expansion. These early bolters lacked the romantic shine of later outlaws because their existence was defined by pure attrition. They were the violent, inevitable byproducts of a penal system that pushed human beings to their absolute physical limits. In 1851, the discovery of gold flooded the isolated colonial landscape with portable wealth. For the men hiding in the bush, the motive shifted entirely from basic survival to highly lucrative profit. This wealth attracted the wild colonial boys, a second generation of outlaws, mostly native-born Australians. They utilized superior bushcraft and fast horses to execute highly coordinated raids on gold escorts, mail coaches, and wealthy pastoral stations. The colonial government met this escalation with extreme force. They passed the Felons Apprehension Act of 1865, a law that legally permitted any citizen or police officer to shoot a declared outlaw on sight without trial. The sudden influx of capitalist wealth turned a scattered survival tactic into a highly organized, heavily armed war against colonial law enforcement. By the 1870s, the rural landscape was divided by a bitter class conflict. Wealthy landowners, known as squatters, monopolized the fertile land, displacing poor selector farmers and breeding a deeply politicized third generation of outlaws. Ned Kelly weaponized this rural anger. His gang actively courted public support by burning bank mortgage records during robberies and publishing anti-authoritarian manifestos that decried police corruption. This ideological war climaxed in 1880 at the Glenrowan Inn. Anticipating a massive police response, the Kelly gang forged Olin plow moldboards. The thick iron breastplates successfully stopped police rifle fire, but they weighed nearly 100 pounds. Under intense fire, the crude joints severely restricted the gang's movement, and the sheer weight left their legs entirely exposed and unprotected. The outlaws built physical armor, but the colonial state deployed a weapon that could not be shot: infrastructure. The expanding electric telegraph network and rapid railway deployments allowed police to coordinate and close the net faster than any horse could gallop. Modern communication and transport systematically dismantled the Kelly Gang. Yet, by framing their final stand as a battle against the establishment, they provided the exact blueprint for the permanent Australian anti-hero. Ned Kelly's death in 1880 is widely cited as the end of the bushrangers. In reality, the physical era of bushranging ended 2 decades later, in 1901, with the hanging of Jimmy Governor, an Aboriginal outlaw. As the Australian colonies federated into a single nation that same year, historians and writers actively constructed a sanitized national myth to unify the country. To build this myth, the historical record was aggressively edited. Public memory excluded female, Indigenous, and Chinese bushrangers fighting in the same bushland. They were erased for not serving the new narrative. A white society required an archetype mirroring its own population. The legend of the Australian bushranger is defined exactly as much by the people the nation chose to forcefully forget as the few it chose to remember. Over a single century, from a starving, desperate convict into a heavily armed gold thief, and finally into a politically charged martyr wearing plow iron. Despite the grim, violent historical reality, modern society continues to embrace this sanitized ghost. The iron helmet endures as a powerful, blank canvas for an innate cultural rejection of authority. The Australian bushranger remains an ultimate historical paradox, a legacy of brutal criminality, completely overwritten by a young nation desperate to forge its own founding mythology. The Australian wilderness is vast, dense, and perfectly equipped to swallow a man without leaving a trace behind. When a high-profile fugitive runs into this terrain, law enforcement responds with massive, coordinated aerial sweeps, pushing helicopters and thermal imaging to their limits across thousands of square miles of unforgiving scrub. On the ground, tactical response groups deploy on foot, heavily armed and moving methodically through thick underbrush to track targets who know the terrain. Recently, a massive manhunt gripped the Victorian high country. A suspect named Desi Freeman fled into the bushland after allegedly shooting and killing 2 police officers who were attempting to serve a warrant. We live in an era of drone surveillance, advanced forensics, and persistent satellite tracking, yet armed suspects still manage to vanish completely into the outback. The scale of the resources required to find these men proves a difficult truth. Despite 21st century technology, the Australian landscape remains the ultimate sanctuary for a desperate criminal. As Freeman disappeared into the wild, locals and commentators quickly reached for a familiar label. They called him a modern-day Ned Kelly. That name evokes a specific 19th century archetype. The historical bushranger, clad in crude iron armor, has been immortalized as a rebellious outlaw fighting back against systemic corruption and police overreach. There is a deeply ingrained cultural reflex in Australia to view fugitives who retreat to the bush as Robin Hood figures. The harshness of the environment lends a certain rugged respectability to anyone who can survive it. This instinct to romanticize the runner obscures the reality of who is actually hiding in the trees. It turns violent men into myths long before the facts come to light. Surviving off the grid is a logistical nightmare. The deep bush offers zero amenities, extreme weather, and constant exposure. Yet some adapt. Malcolm Naden, a former shearer and abattoir worker, evaded police capture for 7 years, earning a reputation as a master bushman. Naden survived by breaking into remote properties to steal thousands of items of food and clothing. At one point, he even lived undetected inside a zoo enclosure, scavenging animal feed. Similarly, the father and son fugitive duo Gino and Mark Stocko managed to stay on the run for 8 years. This map of Australia shows the massive geographical footprint of their evasion. They crossed borders fluidly, moving undetected through rural areas across 3 separate states. They supported themselves by taking transient cash jobs on isolated farms. They used the money to amass an extensive arsenal of stolen weapons while keeping their erratic travel routes off the radar. Their ability to remain hidden for nearly a decade exposes a chilling reality. The outback acts as a highly effective natural fortress for those willing to live like ghosts. Survival is only one half of the equation. The other half is public perception, driven largely by a press eager to sell a compelling narrative. Consider Brendan Abbott, a prison escapee who was immortalized by the media in the 1990s as the Postcard Bandit. The nickname implies a criminal mastermind who mailed taunting postcards to police from various hideouts. The truth is exactly the opposite. Abbott never sent a single postcard to the police. The police sent one to him, trying to bait him. The photos that supposedly mocked authorities were just snapshots from a dropped roll of film left behind by his accomplice. The myth survived because audiences are drawn to the idea of a rebel outsmarting the system. It offers a more entertaining narrative than the mundane reality of a thief evading prison. The title of modern bushranger is rarely earned by the fugitive. It is a fabricated media narrative designed to package a sordid manhunt into public spectacle. Historical bushrangers often claim to fight banking injustices and police corruption, gathering sympathizers who shared their political grievances. Today's fugitives offer no such cause. Malcolm Naden did not retreat to the wilderness to protest the state. He fled because he strangled his 24-year-old cousin to death, murdered a second cousin, and committed aggravated indecent assault against a 15-year-old girl. The Stocko's 8-year run was a trail of intimidation, theft, and property damage that ultimately culminated in the cold-blooded murder of a farm caretaker whose decomposed body was found at their hideout. And Desi Freeman, who styled himself online as a civil rights activist, used that persona as a manipulative smokescreen. He was a pedophile evading a search warrant when he fatally shot 2 police officers. Stripped of the folklore and the media hype, these men are not anti-heroes fighting a corrupt system. They are simply predators hiding from the consequences of their atrocities. Every modern manhunt reaches a breaking point. The bush provides cover, but it cannot permanently withstand the overwhelming, sustained application of modern tactical police force. Malcolm Naden's 7 years in the wild ended in a midnight raid. 20 heavily armed specialist officers converged on a rundown cabin in the dark, and Naden was bitten by a police dog and detained. The Stocko's long run came to a similarly anticlimactic halt. Heavily armed police surrounded their remote farm hideout, and the 2 men were arrested face down in the dirt without a single shot being fired. The modern bushranger legend inevitably fractures under the weight of organized law enforcement. These stories do not end in heroic last stands. They end in pathetic, desperate surrenders. The modern bushranger is a fabrication. It is a cultural ghost story we tell ourselves to make sense of violent men who refuse to face justice. It is an environment so vast and indifferent that it can swallow a person whole for nearly a decade. We shouldn't romanticize the cowardly men who flee into the trees. Instead, we should respect the vast, untamable wilderness that allows monsters to simply vanish.
Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping into an incredibly gritty, ultra-realistic true crime landscape for part 3 of our series on the Australian bushranger. We're going to look way past the folklore, past the old ballads, to examine a really dark, enduring legacy. We're exploring how the vast, unforgiving Australian bush has basically continued to serve as a fortress for a totally new breed of fugitives.
You know, for generations, there's been this widely accepted historical consensus. If you crack open almost any history book, it'll tell you that the age of the lawless bush fugitive, that romanticized outlaw roaming the outback, abruptly ended over a century ago. But as we look at the evidence today, we really have to ask a pretty chilling question.
Did the era of the bushranger actually die in 1880, or did it just evolve into something far, far more dangerous?
Now, to understand the present, we've got to briefly anchor ourselves in the past. Think about these famous last words, such is life. Or maybe it was, ah well, I suppose it has come to this. These are attributed to Ned Kelly right before he was hanged in November 1880. Kelly and his gang had just engaged in their final, absolutely desperate shootout with police at Glenrowan, famously wearing those homemade suits of bulletproof armor. And neutrally speaking, it was this exact moment that birthed a massively powerful, highly politically charged myth that literally still divides people today.
So there's this huge divide. On one hand, you have the 19th century myth, the bushranger, as this Robin Hood folk hero, right? A symbol of Irish Catholic defiance against British colonial authorities and what was seen as an unjust squatter system. But on the other hand, you have the stark 19th century reality. We're talking about a string of violent bank holdups, hostage situations, and the outright murder of police officers at Stringybark Creek. Whether you view Kelly as a persecuted rebel or a murderous outlaw, his death supposedly marked the end of the bushranging era. But here's the catch. The rugged landscape that hit him, it didn't go anywhere.
Which brings us perfectly to the modern era. Case study number 1, the master bushman, Malcolm Naden's evasion.
Let's move through his timeline and see how this builds. Naden was a former shearer, and man, he proved that the deep bush can still swallow a person whole. In June 2005, he fled into the New South Wales bushland, wanted for the murders of 2 young women, Christy Scholes and Letitia Nolan. For years, the trail went completely cold. It's like he vanished. Then, in late 2011, heavily armed tactical police actually cornered him at a campsite near Nowendock. But Naden escaped again, shooting a police officer in the shoulder in the process. It wasn't until March 2012 that he was finally captured. That is 7 terrifying years on the run. To give you a real sense of the massive scale of this manhunt, just think about this number, $250,000. That was the peak reward offered for information leading to Naden's capture. Dozens of specialist officers were stationed in these tiny rural towns, you had helicopters constantly scouring the canopy, and locals were literally sleeping with guns under their pillows. The entire apparatus of modern law enforcement was brought to its knees by one guy who just knew how to hide in the dirt.
So how exactly did he do it? It's wild when you look at his survival tactics. Naden lived completely off the grid, enduring some brutally harsh elements, but he also operated almost like a parasite on the rural fringe. He'd raid these remote properties, stealing thousands of items, food, clothing, crucial survival gear. He even stole weapons from rural homes to arm himself against his pursuers. There are even credible reports he spent time hiding out inside an enclosure at the Western Plains Zoo. It just goes to show, the modern fugitive utilizes the exact same harsh environment as those historical outlaws did.
But let me tell you, the bush takes an incredibly grueling psychological toll. When 20 specialist tactical officers finally surrounded his rundown cabin near Gloucester in a midnight raid, Naden didn't make some grand armored last stand like Ned Kelly. No. Bitten by a police dog and dragged into custody, his reported words to the police were just a quiet, totally exhausted, "Thank God it's over." The romance of the bush? That's a myth. The reality is a desperate, isolating nightmare.
Now, if Malcolm Naden was a master of solitary evasion, our next case study shows what happens when fugitives actually go on the offensive. Part 2, the destructive duo, Gino and Mark Stocco.
8 years. That is the staggering number of years this terrifying father and son team spent crisscrossing state borders as fugitives. Starting around 2007, after a really bitter family separation and some jail time for burglary, they began this itinerant life working on remote farms. But they quickly morphed from drifting laborers into heavily armed phantoms. They utilized remote backroads and nighttime cover to just constantly stay one step ahead of the law. And they didn't just hide in the outback, they launched a highly organized, totally vindictive crime spree across it, treating the Australian landscape like their own personal hunting ground.
Now, what's really interesting and terrifying about their trail of destruction is the sheer malice involved. They didn't just steal to survive. They actively amassed a massive arsenal of stolen, high-powered firearms. And if a farmer crossed them in any way, or even just simply asked them to leave, they exacted brutal revenge. They'd return in the dead of night to burn down entire sheds and properties, causing millions of dollars in damage. Their rampage ultimately escalated to the horrific murder of a 68-year-old caretaker named Rosario Simone on a remote property. And they even engaged in high-stakes shootouts with highway patrol officers.
The key takeaway here is that the Stockos were definitely not anti-establishment rebels with a political cause. They were modern criminals who manipulated the sheer isolation of the bush to wage a literal war on unsuspecting rural families. They exploited the vast outback to vanish like ghosts. As one of their victims heartbreakingly noted, they left people with mental damage probably for the rest of our days, forcing ordinary farmers to sleep with shotguns right beside their beds. Sadly, this is the modern bushranger reality.
And that terrifying reality brings us right up to the present day. Part 3, the high country threat, the Desi Freeman manhunt.
Sticking strictly to the verified facts from reports, Desi Freeman sparked a massive tactical police manhunt in Victoria's high country. He became the absolute focus of this search after allegedly shooting dead 2 police officers, Detective Leading Senior Constable Neil Thompson and Senior Constable Vadim Dewart. This tragic event occurred when they attempted to serve a search warrant at a Porpenka property. Immediately following the shooting, Freeman was last seen heavily armed, fleeing deep into the incredibly dense Victorian bushland.
And of course, the parallels to history were drawn almost immediately. Media reports quickly dubbed him a modern-day Ned Kelly. Why? Because he too used the dense, impenetrable Australian bush as a fortress to hide from the law after allegedly killing police officers. It links our modern true crime reality directly back to our historical starting point. And it really forces us to reckon with how little the geographical dynamic has changed in over 140 years.
So what does this all mean? We need to lay the folklore of the past side by side with the terrifying reality of the present. Let's look at the final verdict on the evolution of the Australian bushranger. Myth versus modern reality.
So the crucial point is, when you compare these eras side by side, the evolution is incredibly stark. Look back at Ned Kelly in 1880. The motive, well, at least as claimed by his sympathizers, was persecution, and it culminated in that theatrical armored shootout. But track that forward. Malcolm Naden's motive, that was pure, desperate evasion to avoid murder charges, just surviving through rural theft. Then you have the Stockos, driven by petty vindictive revenge, utilizing arson and hoarded weapons. The evolution here is a really steep decline from a highly debated political symbol down to entirely self-serving, violent fugitives.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate divide. You've got the romance of the folklore on one side, giving us these grand tales of rebellion, anti-authoritarian heroes, fighting the power. But the modern reality, the actual everyday experience of living in the bush while men like Naden, the Stockos, or Freeman are on a run, that is all about violent fugitives terrorizing isolated rural families. There is absolutely no Robin Hood nobility in breaking into a farmhouse or stealing a family's sense of safety. Because the truth is, the bush remains just as vast, just as dangerous, and just as capable of hiding a fugitive today as it was in the 19th century. Sure, the iron armor might be gone, replaced by stolen 4x4s and modern rifle scopes. But the devastating impact on rural communities? That remains exactly the same. Which leaves us to ponder one final, deeply unsettling question to wrap up this explainer. Knowing what we know now about the men who still flee into the scrub to wage war on society, was Ned Kelly really the last bushranger? All right, let's jump right back into things. In part 2 of our bushranger documentary breakdown, we are diving headfirst into the second era of Australian bushrangers. We're talking about the mid-19th century gold rush. This was a time that ignited a massive, ultra-realistic wave of crime, and it gave rise to some of the absolute most legendary and lethal outlaws in history. So in this explainer, we're going to separate the facts from the folklore and look at the brutal reality of the men who literally terrorized the Australian frontier. So, our agenda for today. First, the Gold Rush Outlaws. 2, the Gardner Hall Gang. 3, Mad Dan Morgan. 4, Captain Thunderbolt. And finally, number 5, the Law Strikes Back.
Okay, part 1, the Gold Rush Outlaws.
You see, bushranging in Australia is basically split into 3 distinct eras. You've got the first era, which was driven by desperate convicts escaping penal brutality. Then you have the third era, featuring those heavily politicized figures like Ned Kelly. But our focus today, we are looking squarely at the middle era. This is the chaotic, incredibly wealth-driven second era that spanned roughly from the 1851 gold rush right up to 1870.
To really understand this period, you have to look at the massive socioeconomic catalyst that just changed everything. Picture this, it's 1851 and a sheer, unprecedented volume of gold is suddenly moving through isolated, poorly maintained country roads. It was an irresistible opportunity,
I mean, you had a severely under-policed frontier, and honestly, that was largely because a ton of the troopers had actually abandoned their posts to try and strike it rich in the goldfields themselves. So you get this massive vacuum of authority combined with all this easily portable wealth, and it just lured these young, native-born bushmen who were drawn to adventure and easy money right into a life of crime.
Part 2. The Gardner Hall Gang.
77 kilograms of gold. Just let that sink in for a second. That was the loot from the June 1862 Eugowra gold escort robbery. Orchestrated by Frank Gardner and his protege Ben Hall, this gang completely overpowered the police escort and pulled off the largest gold heist in Australia's history. To put that into perspective for you today, that haul will be worth roughly $10 million. $10 million! Now, after that massive heist, Gardner actually fled. He was eventually captured, served some time, and then, incredibly, he was exiled to San Francisco in 1874, where he ended up running a saloon of all things. But his gang? They didn't stop. Under Ben Hall's leadership, along with John Gilbert and John Dunn, they actually escalated their attacks. And their secret weapon was their horses. They were expert horsemen who deliberately stole high-pedigree racehorses to just easily outrun the authorities. But what's really fascinating is that unlike a lot of his peers, Ben Hall carefully cultivated this image of a gentleman bushranger. He actively avoided committing direct murder, focusing instead on these brazen, highly publicized robberies of mail coaches and big pastoral estates that thoroughly embarrassed the colonial police. Because, you know, it's a lot easier to rob a mail coach when you ask politely before taking everything they own.
But, as it turns out, a gentlemanly reputation doesn't exactly stop bullets. By May 1865, Hall's gang had become absolute priority targets. Hall's hiding place was actually betrayed by a supposed friend who was safeguarding his escape money. He was ambushed just before dawn by 8 heavily armed policemen and was shot over 30 times as he tried to flee. He reportedly uttered these incredibly dramatic final words to an Aboriginal tracker as he finally fell.
Part 3. Mad Dan Morgan. Now, whatever romanticized myth of the noble highwayman we just talked about, it completely falls apart when we look at men like Daniel Morgan. Heavily documented as Mad Dan or sometimes the Mad Dog, this guy operated with just unpredictable rage and extreme malice. We're talking about a man known to hold entire farm stations hostage. In one really awful instance, he tied a station owner's son to a post just to force him to watch the property burn down. He murdered a station overseer named John McLean, shot a police sergeant named Thomas Smith, and was known to literally fire his weapon at people for almost no reason at all.
Morgan's whole reign of terror finally culminated in this insanely tense standoff in April 1865. He had crossed over into Victoria and raided Peachulba Station, demanding dinner and basically holding everyone inside hostage overnight. But a really brave nursemaid managed to slip away in the pitch dark. She ran to alert a nearby station owner, who immediately rallied the police and local workers. By 3 in the morning, the property was completely surrounded. And when Morgan finally walked out the next morning, he was shot cleanly in the back by a civilian stockman. It just goes to show that the local citizenry had grown just as ruthless as the outlaws themselves by this point. And the sheer hatred that Morgan instilled in the public, it was undeniable. This is where it gets pretty macabre. After he died, there was this grisly posthumous mutilation of his body. A local doctor actually flayed his famous long black beard right off his face to keep it as a trophy. It is a really chilling testament to exactly how deeply despised he was by the very communities he had terrorized.
Part 4. Captain Thunderbolt.
So, Frederick Ward, who is far better known by his amazing alias Captain Thunderbolt, reportedly declared this incredibly dramatic line to a terrified tollkeeper he had just woken up from sleep. And right there, he cemented his larger-than-life persona in Australian folklore right from the very start.
But what made Thunderbolt so wildly successful wasn't actually an appetite for violence. In fact, kind of like Ben Hall, he was famous for avoiding bloodshed and politely emptying pockets all across the frontier. His success came from just incredible endurance and strategy. I mean, he actually swam away from the supposedly inescapable Cockatoo Island penal colony and then managed to rob his way across northern New South Wales for 6.5 years. But here's the thing, he didn't do it alone. He was heavily supported by his Aboriginal wife, Mary Ann Bugg. She was an absolute force. She served as his wily tracker, his commissariat, his eyes, and his ears. Her deep knowledge of the rugged landscape was the absolute crucial advantage that kept Thunderbolt steps ahead of the police for years.
But, all runs eventually come to an end. In May 1870, Thunderbolt's luck finally ran out. It happened during a desperate face-to-face horseback duel in a swamp near Uralla with an off-duty policeman named Constable Walker. Thunderbolt flat-out refused to surrender and was shot dead. His dramatic death pretty much marked the close of the professional bushranger era in New South Wales. But it is important to understand that long before Thunderbolt even fell, the authorities had already implemented some extreme, unprecedented measures to make sure this entire breed of criminal was completely wiped out.
Which brings us to Part 5. The Law Strikes Back.
Driven to absolute embarrassment by these gangs, the New South Wales Parliament rushed through the Felons Apprehension Act in 1865, and the sheer severity of this legislation is staggering. This law entirely revoked a suspect's assumption of innocence. It basically created a martial law-style environment where the line between state justice and extrajudicial killing was completely erased. Anyone harboring outlaws was automatically deemed a felon, and the outlaws themselves, they could be shot dead on sight by literally anyone. No warnings, no calls for surrender required, just dead on sight.
So, behind all the catchy songs and the folklore, there lies a really grim reality check. These men lived intensely violent lives that almost universally ended in bloody, premature deaths. Look at these numbers. Ben Hall was only 27. His partner, John Gilbert, was 25 when he was shot through the heart. Dan Morgan was 34, and Thunderbolt was 35. Not a single one of them even reached middle age before being violently cut down by the very system they tried to outrun.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider the complex legacy of these Gold Rush outlaws. Were these men simply the inevitable products of a harsh, unforgiving frontier, pushed into a corner by draconian laws? Or does the romanticized image of the polite highwaymen just blind us to the sheer terror, theft, and murder they brought to everyday people? I'll leave you to question the true cost of the historical myths we choose to celebrate today.
Let's just dive right into this explainer. We're going to trace the wild action and reaction history of Australia's origins and really explore how a brutally harsh penal colony ended up birthing an entire century of bushranging. It is an absolutely fascinating story of survival, rebellion, and deeply flawed systems. We'll look at the historical roots of crime in Australia and see how early law enforcement had to constantly evolve to deal with a totally new breed of outlaw.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the penal colony catalyst, define exactly who these early outlaws were, and track a full century of bushranging. From there, we'll see how the law struck back, the crucial role of indigenous trackers, and wrap up with the birth of a national myth.
Okay, Part 1. The Penal Colony Catalyst, the Systemic Roots of Rebellion. To really understand early Australian crime, we have to start at the systemic root of it all. 162,000. That is the approximate number of convicts transported to the harsh, starvation-plagued eastern colonies between 1788 and 1852. Just think about that scale for a second. The British Empire basically designed this extremely remote settlement to act as a pressure valve for their overcrowded domestic prisons, but what they actually created was an environment defined by extreme, almost unimaginable physical and legal discipline. We're talking severe food shortages, total isolation, arbitrary sentence extensions for the tiniest infractions, and brutal public lashings.
You know, the extreme desperation of that era is perfectly captured by the words of convict William Westwood. He wrote, "I became a slave, torn from all that was dear to me, and treated more like a beast than a man, until nature could bear no more." And he wasn't just talking. Westwood actually ended up leading a deadly uprising on Norfolk Island after authorities literally confiscated the prisoners' cooking pots. His words just hit the nail on the head, showing exactly what drove men to risk it all and flee the brutal chain gangs and secondary punishment centers like Cockatoo Island. They weren't out looking for riches, right? Initially, they were just running for their lives.
Which brings us to Part 2, defining the outlaws, from survivalists to criminals.
Now, this brutal carceral environment directly created a very unique type of early criminal. See, early bushrangers weren't organized crime syndicates pulling off Hollywood-style bank heists. Not at all. They were what people called bolters. A bolter was simply a convict who had bolted, escaped, into the unforgiving wilderness. Take John Black Caesar, for example. He was a large man of African descent transported on the First Fleet, and he had a massive appetite. He simply couldn't survive on those meager, starvation-level prison rations, so what did he do? He fled to the bush to steal food from settlers' gardens just to stay alive. Some of these escapees even lived alongside Aboriginal groups and adopted their survival skills. But eventually, that mere survivalism started morphing into active robbery. Moving right along to part 3, a century of bushranging, the 3 eras of the outlaw.
As the colony's infrastructure and wealth expanded, we start to see 3 really distinct phases of bushranging emerge. You have the convict bolters starting around 1790, then the Gold Rush outlaws kicking off in 1851, and finally, the politicized gangs taking over around 1870. These eras directly reflect the huge socioeconomic shifts of the developing nation over 100 years. Essentially, as Australia changed, so did its criminals.
It's fascinating to see how the demographics of these outlaws evolved. We start off with the convict bolters, those starving, desperate escapees focused completely on wilderness survival. But then the gold rush hits in the 1850s, and the outlaws completely evolve. They become these native-born, highly mobile youth, guys like Ben Hall and Frank Gardner. Suddenly, they had access to incredible wealth being transported across highly isolated terrain, so they started raiding gold escorts and mail coaches, using advanced bushcraft and excellent horses. And then finally, by the 1870s, we get the politicized gangs. These were second-generation, much poorer farming families, often called selectors, who were locked in this bitter, systemic land dispute with the incredibly wealthy, politically powerful pastoral elite, known as squatters. Gangs like Ned Kelly's utilized the Bush Telegraph, which was basically a massive network of sympathetic locals, and they escalated things to high-profile bank raids, taking hostages, and even dropping political manifestos to justify their actions against what they believed was a totally corrupt state.
And that leads us to part 4, the law strikes back, escalation and the state response.
So as these bushrangers grew more sophisticated and really started targeting the wealthy squattocracy, the state was forced into a massive reaction. Over in London at the time, they were developing the Peelian civic police model, which was all about community service and crime prevention. But in early Australia, completely different story. Authorities adopted a paramilitary model, much closer to the Royal Irish Constabulary style. Australian policing did not begin as a friendly community service. It began as a highly militarized force designed specifically to control convicts, suppress indigenous populations, and protect colonial wealth. Because a lot of these officers were urban recruits or former soldiers with zero connection to the rural bushworkers, it generated this massive, deep-seated resentment among the poorer classes.
The state's desperation to protect the pastoral elite eventually culminated in some incredibly drastic steps. In 1865, New South Wales enacted the Felons Apprehension Act, and wow, this was a real game changer. It legally allowed anyone to shoot a declared outlaw on sight. Literally, no trial, no jury, just shoot on sight. Even more shockingly, it enforced collective punishment. The state could prosecute anyone even suspected of harboring or giving a scrap of food to a bushranger. Basically, the government temporarily dismantled its own liberal legal framework just to try and exterminate the bushranger threat.
Part 5. Indigenous Trackers. Navigating the Uncharted Bush.
So, the law had passed these strict new acts, but they ran into a massive practical problem. Those urban-recruited cavalry-style police officers were completely outmatched by the rugged Australian terrain. I mean, their heavy military saddles and long stirrups made them virtually useless in the thick scrub. So, to navigate the uncharted bush, colonial authorities actively recruited Aboriginal trackers. Their environmental skills were entirely unmatched by any European. But the deep, tragic irony here is that while the state relied incredibly heavily on these indigenous men for survival against the bushrangers, they routinely denied those same trackers basic financial and social rights. And even worse, the colonial government sometimes misused these native police units in violent frontier conflicts, forcing them to round up or disperse other indigenous groups.
Finally, Part 6, the birth of a myth, the end of an era, and the rise of a legend. This long, systemic war between a heavily militarized state, aided by those trackers, and the increasingly politicized outlaws finally came to a dramatic head. The whole thing erupted in 1878 when Ned Kelly and his gang fled to the bush. See, Ned Kelly wasn't just a thief to most people. His flamboyant, armored defiance symbolized poor Australians' deep, historical distrust of a corrupt police force. It all culminated in a massive, incredibly violent tactical siege at a hotel in Glenrowan. After Kelly was captured, he was executed in 1880. And historically speaking, that event effectively ended the physical era of bushranging. The rapidly spreading network of telegraphs and railways had finally conquered the remote bush, and there was just nowhere left to hide.
So, the crucial question we really have to ask ourselves is this. If bushranging was physically stamped out by the law by 1880, why on earth did the bushranger become an enduring, romanticized symbol of Australian anti-authoritarianism? How exactly do violent criminals become beloved national heroes?
Well, the answer lies in the culture. Through early cinema, literature, and folklore, the incredibly grim reality of the penal colony and the violent highwaymen was entirely reshaped. In fact, in 1906, Australia produced The Story of the Kelly Gang, which was actually the world's very first full-length narrative feature film, and it was a massive runaway hit. You see, a culture that was originally born out of a deeply oppressive carceral state ultimately chose to immortalize the outlaws who fought the system, rather than the deeply flawed paramilitary police forces who upheld it. And just like that, the myth of the ultimate rebel was born.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought to consider at the end of our explainer today. When a nation actively chooses to celebrate its rebels and turns violent histories into romantic myths, who are we inadvertently forgetting? Does this romanticizing kind of blind us to the harsh, brutal, systemic realities of how Australia was actually founded? It's a hugely complex history, but digging into the real story behind these legends gives us a much clearer picture of the past. Thank you so much for joining me today, and hey, keep questioning the history around you.
Hey everyone, welcome back, Focused Learners, to another deep dive. Today we're continuing our journey through the history of crime and punishment down under in our explainer, Australian Criminology Part 2, Crisis and Catalyst. We are exploring a fascinating, albeit pretty dark theme today. We're going to look at how Australia's modern justice system was literally forged in the fires of its absolute darkest moments. From terrifying individual perpetrators to, well, deeply entrenched networks of institutional decay, the system we rely on today was built as a direct reaction to some truly shocking historical realities. Okay, let's dive into this. It is so easy to think of the law as something that's just quietly written in rooms by politicians, right? But in reality, true structural reform is almost always reactive. It takes an extreme outlier event, a crisis that literally shakes society to its core, to act as a powerful catalyst for systemic change. And in Australia, we see this pattern repeating across several decades. The system didn't just casually evolve, it had to adapt to survive the unthinkable. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the chilling reality of modern Australian serial killers. Second, we'll move from individual criminality to institutional rot, with the Fitzgerald Inquiry in Queensland, and then followed closely by the Wood Royal Commission in New South Wales. Finally, we'll examine the ultimate catalyst, the Port Arthur tragedy, and the sweeping 1996 gun law reforms that followed. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Modern Australian Serial Killers. You know, when you actually look at the data from the National Homicide Monitoring Program, serial murder is exceptionally rare in Australia. It accounts for basically just 1% of all homicides. Over a 17-year monitoring window, researchers identified just 13 perpetrators and 52 victims. But here's the thing. Despite this absolute statistical rarity, these crimes heavily dictate public safety frameworks and completely grip the public fascination. It's that 1% that leaves a permanent scar on the national psyche, and it forces the criminal justice system to rapidly evolve its forensic and investigative capabilities. When we examine some of the most notorious behavioral typologies, you have Ivan Millet, the backpack murderer, who between 1989 and 1993 abducted young travelers along the Hume Highway, taking them deep into the Belanglo State Forest. Then you have John Bunting and Robert Wagner, responsible for the horrific bodies in the Barrels murders in Snowtown. Their MO was this twisted vigilante-themed torture that resulted in 11 and 10 victims respectively. And Paul Denyer, who stalked the Bayside suburbs of Frankston in 1993, engaging in rapid, severe knife attacks against 3 young women. While their qualitative methods were gruesome and highly varied, their judicial outcomes were absolute. All of them were ultimately apprehended, convicted, and given life sentences, with figures like Millet dying in prison. The system worked exactly as it was supposed to, excising them completely. But that brings us to a frankly terrifying structural question. The system is perfectly designed to lock away the Millets and the deniers of the world. But what happens when the very people meant to catch the criminals are actually the ones running the crime syndicates? We have to shift our focus now from individual deviance to deeply entrenched institutional corruption.
Section 2. Queensland's Fitzgerald Inquiry. Back in late 1980s Queensland, the division between state authority and criminal enterprise hadn't just blurred, it had completely dissolved. For decades, police insiders referred to their system of corruption simply as the joke. And it was exactly that, a deeply entrenched, highly organized payoff distribution and bribery network.
Essentially, senior police were receiving massive kickbacks to protect illegal brothels, SP bookmakers, and illegal casinos. This wasn't just a few bad apples, you guys. This was the whole orchard. This systemic disease was finally exposed by Tony Fitzgerald QC. He broke the notorious police code of silence by utilizing a brilliantly effective legal mechanism, granting prosecution immunity to key witnesses, which allowed the corrupt network to rapidly unravel from the inside out.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer level of power that was shattered by this inquiry. It was unprecedented. We aren't just talking about a couple of street cops here. Terry Lewis was the actual police commissioner. He accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, was convicted, jailed for over 10 years, and even stripped of his knighthood. Jack Herbert was the bagman who collected the money. He rolled over and became the star witness. And the shockwaves reached the absolute highest levels of government. Premier Jabielka Pedersen was forced to resign and even face trial for perjury. This was a monumental catalyst that birthed modern oversight agencies in Australia, strictly to ensure this level of executive rot could never ever take hold again.
Section 3, NSW's Wood Royal Commission. If Queensland had the joke, New South Wales had the laugh. And trust me, it was anything but funny. Between 1994 and 1997, Justice James Roland Wood investigated a police force that had crossed a truly terrifying line. This wasn't just turning a blind eye for a bribe anymore. This was direct joint venture partnerships in serious crimes. Detectives were literally fabricating evidence, stealing and reselling drug seizures, and, horrifyingly, providing protection for organized pedophile networks. To catch them, Justice Wood had to use extraordinary powers, including self-certifying electronic surveillance and wiring up a corrupt King's Cross detective named Trevor Haken to capture executive-level criminality on hidden audio and video.
Beyond the shocking headlines, we have to acknowledge the incredibly severe human cost of uncovering all this truth. The fallout was devastating. As the Commission's net closed in, the pressure on those exposed was immense, with multiple individuals connected to the findings tragically taking their own lives rather than face the consequences. It serves as a stark, moody piece of history that reminds us of the far-reaching, devastating consequences of having to surgically excise a tumor that has grown deep inside the very institutions meant to protect us.
Section 4. The Port Arthur Catalyst. Let's move to and see how this builds into the darkest tragedy in modern Australian history. In the 18 years prior to 1996, Australia had experienced 13 mass shootings. Then came April 28, 1996. A lone gunman using semi-automatic weapons killed 35 people at Port Arthur, Tasmania. It's an unimaginable crisis. But what is truly remarkable, from a legislative standpoint, is the speed of the reaction. The tragedy occurred on April 28th. By May 10th, literally just 12 days later, the state and federal governments had agreed upon sweeping, uniform gun control laws. An unimaginable crisis sparked a massive, immediate legislative pivot.
The political response was swift, and it was entirely bipartisan. The newly elected Conservative Prime Minister, John Howard, stated plainly, "There is no legitimate interest served, in my view, by the free availability in this country of weapons of this kind." This directly illustrates the immediate political consensus that emerged. The focus was entirely 100% on preventing a recurrence by restricting the tools used in the massacre.
Section 5, 1996 Gun Law Reforms. Prior to this moment, Australia's gun laws were highly fragmented. It was a total state-by-state patchwork. The National Firearms Agreement, or NFA, changed all of that. It instituted a standardized federal model. The mechanics were incredibly strict. An outright ban on rapid-fire long guns like semi-automatic rifles and shotguns. It mandated that every single firearm be individually registered to its owner. Private owner-to-owner sales banned entirely. A compulsory 28-day cooling-off period was instituted for any new purchases, and a strict genuine reason was required just to own a gun. And importantly, personal protection was explicitly ruled out as a genuine reason.
But as you can imagine, passing the law was really only half the battle. They actually had to remove the existing weapons from circulation. So the government instituted a massive mandatory buyback scheme funded by a temporary increase in the Medicare tax levy. Over 700,000 firearms were surrendered and destroyed. To put the sheer scale of that logistical feat into perspective, that was removing 700,000 guns from an adult population of just about 12 million people at the time. It effectively shrank the private arsenal by an estimated 1/5.
And this brilliantly illustrates the objective impact of that legislation. Researchers and public health experts pored over the data in the decade that followed. They found that while firearm deaths were actually already declining, the rate of that decline greatly accelerated after 1996. Firearm homicides dropped by 59%, and firearm suicides plummeted by staggering 65%. Perhaps most starkly of all, in the decade following the reforms, a nation that had seen 13 mass shootings in the prior 18 years experienced absolutely zero fatal mass shootings.
Which brings us to the end of today's explainer, and to a pretty crucial question I want to leave you all with. Whether we're talking about the horrific acts of individual serial killers, the deeply entrenched rot of police corruption, or a mass tragedy that changes national laws in just 12 days, must we always wait for an unimaginable crisis to forge a stronger system? History clearly shows us how Australia reacted and adapted when forced to the absolute brink. But it also serves as a stark reminder of our ongoing need for vigilance against criminality and institutional decay. Hopefully, we don't always need a crisis to act as the catalyst. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into part 2 of our deep dive into Australian crime and criminology. We are totally leaving behind the 19th century colonial bushrangers today and stepping directly into the neon-lit, gritty era of the modern Australian underworld. We're going to explore the explosion of the illicit drug trade, some absolutely massive police corruption scandals, and how the modern outlaw eventually had to retreat right back into the shadows of the bush.
All right, let's kick things off by confronting a pretty chilling reality. You know, we usually think of organized crime and law enforcement as, well, opposites, right? Good guys versus bad guys. But history actually shows us a deeply entrenched, codependent relationship. This wasn't just a case of a few rotten apples spoiling the bunch. No, this was a deeply systemic pattern where the very people tasked with hunting the underworld were, in a lot of ways, actually managing it.
It's wild how Prohibition basically created organized crime in Australia. I mean, it literally bred it. Back in 1916, a law forced pubs to close at 6 p.m., which instantly sparked a massive black market for sly grog. Then, jump to 1927. A new act introduced mandatory jail terms for carrying unlicensed firearms. The result? Criminals in places like Sydney's Darlinghurst simply ditched the guns and switched to cutthroat razors, giving birth to the legendary razor gangs. By the 1920s, banning narcotics like cocaine turned individual street offenders into full-blown, highly organized crime syndicates. And as we roll into the 60s and 80s, all that illicit cash starts fueling highly lucrative, state-sanctioned protection rackets.
Which brings us perfectly to our first major theme. Part 1, the system, the rise and the rot.
During this era, there was this massive, deeply entrenched symbiosis between criminals and rogue cops. The whole engine for this was the legislative ban on things people really wanted: gambling, alcohol, prostitution, and drugs. The profit margins on these black markets were just so mind-bogglingly huge that they generated enough capital to corrupt the entire state enforcement apparatus. What's super fascinating, though, is the stark contrast in how this corruption actually played out depending on where you were. Take Queensland, for example. They had this state-sanctioned protection racket that insiders literally called the Joke. Run by top brass like Commissioner Frank Bischoff, and later a rat pack of detectives including Terry Lewis, it was basically a highly structured tax collection system. They'd take organized payoffs from illegal bookies, casinos, and brothels. But then, you look at New South Wales. Their system was known as the Green Light, and man, it was so much darker. In the 70s and 80s, corrupt detectives formed direct, joint venture partnerships with violent criminals. Police were quite literally giving criminals a green light to commit armed robberies and deal high-grade heroin with zero police interference, all in exchange for a massive, massive cut of the profits.
But of course, a system that corrupt can't stay hidden forever, which leads us to part 2, the reckoning, the commissions.
The absolute failure of internal police accountability essentially gave birth to the modern era of independent integrity commissions. Up in Queensland, it was investigative journalists who finally blew the lid off this thing. Specifically, Chris Masters with his documentary The Moonlight State and reporter Phil Dickey. This sparked the Fitzgerald Inquiry, which ran from '87 to '89. And let me tell you, the Fitzgerald Inquiry signaled that the joke was officially over. Over 238 days of public hearings, with testimony from 339 witnesses, they completely tore down the Queensland system. It ended with 4 government ministers and Police Commissioner Terry Lewis going to prison. Lewis even lost his knighthood. Politically, it was a total earthquake, helping to end the National Party's 32-year run in power.
Meanwhile,
Down in New South Wales, they had their own massive reckoning with the Wood Royal Commission in the mid-90s. Tasked with figuring out if corruption was systemic and entrenched, what Justice James Wood found was just horrific. The commission exposed King's Cross detectives who were routinely fabricating false confessions, they called it verbaling, stealing drug busts to sell themselves, and colluding with heavy-hitting drug traffickers. But it gets worse. It uncovered this absolutely depraved relationship where corrupt detectives were protecting a pedophile syndicate. Cops were providing advanced warnings to people committing heinous crimes against children. It completely shattered the police commissioner's claims that corruption was just a few bad apples, and he was forced to resign.
Now, as an impartial explainer, we absolutely have to look at the controversy that surrounded these very commissions. Take a look at this whistleblower document from former police officer Michael McGann. It shows that the investigators themselves were accused of some incredibly severe misconduct. According to these allegations, Wood Royal Commission investigators were actually accused of fabricating evidence and even supplying high-grade heroin to local drug dealers as part of their undercover operations, actions that supposedly had some tragic, fatal consequences for local addicts.
So the real takeaway here is that sure, these commissions successfully cut out a massive tumor of corruption, but critics argue they crossed some serious ethical lines to do it. You can see in this excerpt, they actually compare the commission's methods to the 13th century inquisitions. It highlights the immense psychological toll of the hearings, noting a number of suicides directly linked to the inquiry. It just goes to show how incredibly messy, complicated, and brutal this systemic purge really was. It was definitely not a clean sweep.
Ultimately, the long-term fallout of these inquiries was a total rip-down and rebuild of the Australian legal and administrative framework. The official reports from that era detail how clearing out the corrupt officers at the top, rolling out advanced covert surveillance, creating independent watchdogs, and mandating video recordings for all police interviews created a massive deterrent. It effectively smashed the golden era of police underworld collusion. Suddenly, the environment was no longer safe for those sprawling, highly protected syndicates from the 70s and 80s.
And this brings us to a really fascinating pivot. Think about it. If you're a criminal in modern Australia and you no longer have this corrupt police network shielding you, what do you actually do when the heat turns up? Where does the modern Australian outlaw go?
Well, they go off the grid. Part 3. The Outliers, the Modern Bushranger.
Surprisingly enough, the answer to where they went takes a page right out of the 19th century. They retreated back into the incredibly stark, hostile isolation of the bush. I want to introduce you to Malcolm Naden. He was a former shearer and abattoir worker who completely vanished in June 2005. He was wanted for the horrific murders of 2 young women, his cousin, Letitia Nolan, and Christy Scholes. Facing an absolutely airtight brief of evidence, Naden didn't try to bribe his way out, and he didn't call on underworld connections. Instead, this self-taught master bushman literally disappeared into the dense, unforgiving Australian outback, and he managed to evade capture for nearly 7 years.
The sheer scale of the manhunt for this guy was mind-blowing. As the years dragged on and police frustration mounted, the reward for information leading to his capture just kept climbing. It actually peaked at a massive $250,000. Think about that for a second. $250,000 on his head. He became the undisputed most wanted man in New South Wales.
Honestly, the sheer tenacity it takes to survive off the grid like that is almost unbelievable. His evasion tactics were straight out of a movie. Get this. At one point in late 2005, he was reportedly living completely undetected inside a zoo enclosure at the Western Plains Zoo in Dubbo. He survived by living off the rugged land and systematically breaking into remote sheds and properties, stealing thousands of items of food, clothing, and weapons over the years. In December 2011, heavily armed tactical police actually cornered him at a bush campsite, but Naden escaped again, shooting a police officer in the shoulder during a chaotic midnight firefight in the scrub.
And you know what? He wasn't the only one adopting this rugged, off-the-grid lifestyle. The vast Australian landscape is still a massive hiding spot if you're desperate enough. Just look at the father and son fugitive duo, Gino and Mark Stocco. They spent 8 whole years on the run from police, dodging authorities across multiple states for property offenses and other crimes, entirely by moving like ghosts through the rural fringes.
But at the end of the day, the bush can only hide you for so long in the modern world. Naden's insane run finally crashed to a halt on March 22, 2012. Imagine this, a pitch-black, midnight raid by 20 heavily armed tactical officers who surrounded a rundown cabin near Gloucester. Naden was bitten by a police dog and finally taken down. The arresting officers actually noted his famous last words as a free man were, "Thank God it's over."
He pleaded guilty to all 32 charges against him and was handed a life sentence without the possibility of parole.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we've gone on quite the journey together, haven't we? From the razor gangs of Darlinghurst, straight into the corrupt halls of power in Queensland and New South Wales, and finally back out into the brutal, isolating Australian bush. We've seen corrupt systems completely broken down and lone fugitives ultimately captured. So I leave you with this to chew on. Has the legendary Australian outlaw myth, from Ned Kelly all the way to Malcolm Naden, finally been extinguished by modern law enforcement and technology? Or is it just going to keep evolving, finding entirely new shadows to operate in? Thanks for joining me today, and keep asking questions.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking an incredibly violent, just absolutely fascinating story, the evolution of the Australian underworld. We're going to trace the entire criminal lineage of a nation. We'll start with desperate, starving bush convicts fighting for survival, all the way up to the highly organized, incredibly wealthy urban crime bosses of the 1920s. It's a journey that really reveals as much about the institutions of law and order as it does about the criminals themselves. And it helps us understand the true roots of modern organized crime today. Okay, let's dive into this. We have a lot of ground to cover, so here's our chronological roadmap. We're looking at the convict bolters, the gold rush outlaws, Kelly and political rebellion, the myth on screen, and finally, the rise of urban syndicates. Section 1. The Convict Bolters, 1790 to 1850, Survival in the Wilderness. The very first era of Australian crime, it actually wasn't born out of greed or organized ambition. It was birthed directly from the unbelievably harsh conditions of the British penal colony established at Botany Bay back in 1788. Over an 80-year period, an astonishing 162,000 convicts were transported to Australia, and the conditions they faced were just unimaginably grim. We're talking severe food shortages, completely meager rations being cut even further, and a system of discipline that relied heavily on brutal public floggings. It was an environment perfectly designed to punish, so naturally, people sought a way out. This pure desperation led to the creation of what were called the bolters. A bolter was an early term for a convict who escaped the penal colony to survive by robbing settlers in the wild bushland. The crucial point here is that these weren't criminal masterminds. They were desperate escapees fleeing into totally uncharted wilderness. One of the very first was a man named John Black Caesar, an African convict who escaped in 1789. He survived by stealing food from settlers' gardens. Guys like him essentially birthed the entire Australian bushranger legend out of sheer raw survivalism. So, across 3 distinct eras, you see shifting economics and developing infrastructure totally mutating these criminals. We just talked about the survival-driven convict bolters from 1790 to 1850. But as the colonies expanded and wealth flooded in, the nature of the bushranger radically transformed through the gold rush outlaws and into the politicized gangs. Section 2. The Gold Rush Outlaws, 1851 to 1870, Pursuit of Wealth and Adventure. Right, so in the 1850s, the discovery of gold completely changed the game. Suddenly, mail coaches carrying massive quantities of gold and cash turned into highly targeted prizes. Because of this, the demographics and the methods of outlaws shifted radically. We go from those escaped convicts of the first era, relying on small theft to survive, to the second era, heavily armed native-born Australian youths executing these massive, coordinated raids on banks and gold escorts for pure profit. And then, by the third era, it morphs again. It becomes about political rebellion involving second-generation selector families who felt marginalized by wealthy landowners. The motivations completely evolved over time. To really understand this gold rush era, let's contrast 2 of its most notorious figures. First, you have Ben Hall. He pulled off the largest gold heist in Australian history at Eugowra. We're talking a haul worth around $10 million today. He was a highly successful highwayman who, for a really long time actually, avoided taking a life. But then, on the flip side, you have Dan Morgan, dubbed Mad Dog. His reputation was one of just terrifying, bloodthirsty unpredictability. He was prone to these violent rages and, incredibly, records show he once shot a policeman dead simply because the officer greeted him with a hello, which is definitely one way to avoid small talk. Obviously, the government had to respond to this mounting chaos and violence, and they did it with sweeping, brutal legislation. In 1865, they introduced the Felons Apprehension Act. Basically, this law meant that once a gang was formally declared outlawed, anyone could legally shoot them on sight without warning. It also made harboring or assisting them a serious crime. It effectively turned these guys into literally walking targets. And it worked. This is the exact legislation that allowed police to ambush Ben Hall, who ended up dying with 30 police bullets in his back.
Section 3, Kelly and Political Rebellion, 1870 to 1900, the final era of the bushranger.
By the late 19th century, this outlaw violence became intertwined with a really potent sense of political resistance. And this is embodied most famously by Ned Kelly. There's a quote that says he is considered by some to have been merely a murderous outlaw, but by many others as a hero of his time. And that captures the deep public division over his gang perfectly. To the authorities, they were just violent thieves and murderers, gunning down police officers. But to a huge portion of the rural poor, particularly Irish immigrants who felt deeply oppressed by an unfair legal system, the Kelly gang came to symbolize a fierce, relatable resistance against systemic police bias and elite privilege. And there's a physical object that speaks volumes about that symbolism: the green sash. It was a potent emblem of rebellion, defiance, and Irish-Australian solidarity. Kelly was actually awarded this sash as a boy for saving someone from drowning, and he wore it right under his heavy, handcrafted iron tactical armor during his final shootout with police at Glenrowan. It was a very intentional emblem of his identity and his defiance. Kelly was ultimately captured and hanged at just 25 years old, but by that point, he'd already cemented himself as an anti-authoritarian folk legend.
Section 4, The Myth on Screen, Cementing the Australian Legend.
Now, what's really interesting here is how quickly the ink was barely dry on the history books before the entertainment industry stepped in. Just 26 years after Kelly's execution, in 1906, the story of the Kelly gang premiered. It ran for over an hour and is widely recognized today as the world's very first full-length narrative feature film. It heavily glorified the gang's chivalry and their daring exploits. In fact, it was so influential that local authorities actively banned the film in regional areas, the so-called Kelly Country, because they were legitimately terrified that a movie would inspire a totally new generation to take up arms against the police. But honestly, the bans didn't even matter, because the film made an estimated £25,000 at the box office. That was an absolute fortune at the time. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the public had an insatiable, enduring appetite for this romanticized myth of the bushranger. Section 5. Rise of Urban Syndicates, the 1920s Concrete Jungle. So, while audiences were busy watching bushrangers on screen, real-world crime had moved out of the wild bushland and into the gritty, neon-lit inner-city slums. In the early 20th century, the government introduced these incredibly strict social laws. They forced pubs to close early at 6 p.m., they cracked down hard on street prostitution, and they criminalized narcotics. But instead of creating this moral utopia they were aiming for, these laws inadvertently birthed highly lucrative, incredibly profitable urban black markets. Naturally, a new, ruthless breed of urban gangs stepped right in to exploit them. The wild bushman was officially replaced by the sharply dressed urban crime boss. We're talking about figures like Melbourne Squizzy Taylor, a violent pickpocket, armed robber, and extortionist, and the brutal razor gangs over in Sydney's Darlinghurst. These bosses built highly resilient criminal empires. How? Well, they abandoned the old shoot-on-sight bushranger tactics and instead weaponized systematic police corruption. They monopolized these illicit markets through brutal street violence, like those famous razor gang wars in Darlinghurst, all while actively bribing the authorities to just look the other way. Now, the government did try to fight back. Step 1, they passed the Consorting Act in 1929, making it literally illegal to just hang out with known criminals. But, ironically, it dramatically backfired. By driving crime off the streets, they unintentionally pushed it indoors into highly organized, lucrative syndicates, like indoor brothels. And these syndicates were so wealthy, they could easily afford to pay off the police, deeply entrenching systemic protection rackets. So without meaning to, the state had essentially institutionalized a codependent relationship between state authority and the underworld. Which brings us to our final lingering thought. From starving convicts stealing food in the bush to armored rebels fighting the state, right down to urban bosses buying off the police in Darlinghurst, is modern organized crime just a new iteration of that very same anti-authoritarian bushranger spirit? It really forces us to consider how a nation's identity and its institutions remain permanently scarred, shaped, and perhaps forever linked to its outlaws. Thank you for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you a fascinating new lens on the history of crime. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing a clinical, documentary-style deep dive into modern Australian extremism. Specifically, we're tracking the rapid rise and the recent intense legal crackdown on neo-Nazi and far-right networks operating right here in Australia. Okay, let's dive right into this with a pretty sobering assessment from ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization. In their 2025 annual threat assessment, they laid it out bluntly. Quote, "We expect nationalist and racist violent extremists to continue their efforts to mainstream and expand their movement. They will undertake provocative, offensive, and increasingly high-profile acts." End quote. I mean, that really sets the stakes for us today. We're not talking about a few isolated folks in a basement. We're looking at highly organized, deliberate efforts to push these exclusionary ideologies right into the mainstream public eye. Section 1. The Modern Extremist Threat. To really understand what's happening now, we have to look past the old 20th century history of these movements. Today, we're dealing with highly organized, extremely internet-savvy groups, and their history shows a really clear pattern of consolidation. It's kind of like a dark corporate merger. Step 1. You have the Antipodian Resistance, formed in 2016, which became known for spreading hate materials. Step 2 is the Lads Society, a far-right nationalist club focused on physical training. But here's the critical part. In late 2020, these fringe groups strategically merged to form the National Socialist Network, or NSN. And this wasn't just a rebrand, no. It was a totally calculated move to pool their money, their legal resources, and their manpower to amplify their message under one single banner. So the crucial point is defining what the NSN actually is. They're a Melbourne-based neo-Nazi organization led by a guy named Thomas Sewell. They openly advocate for a quote-unquote white revolution. But it's how they operate that really caught law enforcement's attention. Instead of hiding in the shadows, they rely heavily on intimidation, highly coordinated media manipulation, and these massive attention-grabbing stunts. They deliberately push themselves into the news cycle because that is exactly how they recruit young, disenfranchised men into their ranks. Section 2. Tactics and Public Provocation. When you map out their actions chronologically, you see this very clear, deliberate escalation. They were constantly testing the legal boundaries. In January 2021, over the Australia Day weekend, about 40 masked men tied to the NSN went out to the Grampians National Park in Victoria. They literally burned a cross and chanted "White Power." Then, fast forward to March 2023, they moved from the remote bush right into major capital cities, performing Nazi salutes on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House during clashes with opposing groups. And the escalation just kept going. By August 2025, during the March for Australia rallies, NSN members were getting into organized brawls in city centres and even led a physical attack on an Indigenous protest site in Melbourne called Camp Sovereignty. It took a massive police response just to break it up. But the real tipping point, that arguably hit in November 2025. Around 60 NSN associates held an anti-Semitic rally right outside the New South Wales Parliament in the middle of Sydney. And the way they did it was incredibly calculated. They essentially exploited a legal loophole. They framed the rally as a legitimate political demonstration, claiming they were trying to formally register a political party called White Australia. By wrapping themselves in the protections of political organizing, they basically stopped the police from immediately breaking it up. This brazen display right outside a major government building, that seriously accelerated public and government demands to completely close those loopholes. Section 3. The reality behind the rhetoric. Now, what's really interesting here is the jarring contrast between their public posturing and what they're actually doing. On one hand, you have these grandiose political ambitions, right? They're trying to register parties with names like Terra Australis Alba to legally influence politics. But on the other hand, you have the raw criminal reality. The core of this movement isn't just about exclusionary ideas. It's directly tied to a long string of violent, real-world convictions among its actual leadership. Just look at the criminal record of their leader, Thomas Sewell. It really paints the full picture. In 2021, he was convicted for violent disorder after an attack on hikers at the Cathedral Range. This altercation was so brutal that Sewell's own blood was actually found inside the victim's car, and he served jail time for it. That same year, he assaulted a Channel 9 security guard in Melbourne, an incident completely caught on video. Then, in 2025, he was found guilty of intimidating a police officer. On top of all that, he faced more charges for violent disorder from those physical clashes at the Camp Sovereignty protests we talked about earlier.
And that brings us to the number 72. 72 days. That is exactly how long Thomas Sewell spent on remand in protective custody in late 2025. After the violence at Camp Sovereignty, a magistrate flat out refused him bail. The ruling essentially said there were absolutely no conditions that could reduce the unacceptable risk he posed to the community. So you can see the judicial system finally stepping up and treating the physical threat from this leadership with intense seriousness.
Section 4. Public and legal backlash. Let's see how this builds, because the legal dismantling of this group happened remarkably fast, over just a few months. In November 2025, the private sector struck first. Banks froze the NSN's accounts, literally cutting off their funding and paralyzing their operations. Then, in January 2026, the Australian Parliament stepped in and passed sweeping new federal hate speech laws, giving police much more power to go after targeted vitriol. And the final blow? On May 15, 2026, the government used those brand new laws to completely ban the National Socialist Network, officially classifying it as a prohibited organization. So, problem solved, right? Well, not exactly. Even though the NSN announced they were disbanding, mostly because organizers were suddenly looking at up to 15 years in prison, the threat is very much ongoing. Intelligence reports, including from the NSW Parliament, warn that they're still actively organizing. They've just migrated to highly encrypted messaging apps, which makes tracking them incredibly tough. And they're not broke either. They're pulling in overseas funding from sympathizers in the US and the UK. In fact, former members managed to raise around $157,000 just to fight the federal ban in court. The scary reality is that extremist activity hasn't just vanished. It's simply been pushed underground, and it's rapidly adapting. Which really leaves us with this final, critical question to chew on. When extremist groups are legally forced to disband, does the ideology actually disappear? Or does it just mutate and find new, hidden spaces to operate? Thinking back to that chilling ASIO warning from the beginning, it's clear the challenge of domestic security is far from over. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning what you see.
So picture this. It's November 8th, 2025, right outside the New South Wales Parliament House in Sydney. You've got a group of about 60 men gathered there. They're all dressed entirely in black, their faces completely covered. They're posing for photos in front of this massive banner that says "Abolish the Jewish Lobby." And they start chanting slogans that are, well, historically tied straight to the Hitler Youth. Now, this wasn't some historical reenactment or a movie set. This was a highly organized, modern-day demonstration by the neo-Nazi group known as the National Socialist Network. It was this visceral, shocking display happening literally right on the doorstep of Australian democracy.
And the thing is, this wasn't a one-off. A really similar demonstration unfolded on the steps of the Victorian Parliament, this time with a banner claiming "Jews hate freedom." Masked extremists were deliberately orchestrating these highly visible public displays of intimidation. These weren't just isolated fringe outbursts anymore. Highly visible events exactly like this one became the absolute catalyst for a sweeping, unprecedented overhaul of Australian criminal law. The government realized pretty quickly that they had a massive problem on their hands, and the existing laws, they simply weren't equipped to handle it.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to take a completely impartial look at the rapid accumulation of criminal laws in Australia designed to combat this rise in right-wing extremism. We're going to dive into the recent Commonwealth and state legislation banning Nazi symbols, gestures, and the ultimate prescription of hate groups. But, importantly, we're also going to explore the intense legal and constitutional debates that these new laws have triggered across the board.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First up, the rise of extremism. 2, the legal loophole. 3, the legislative crackdown. 4, the free speech debate. And finally, number 5, the constitutional clash.
Okay, let's jump right in. Part 1, the rise of extremism.
To really understand the government's reaction, you have to look at the data. The Executive Council of Australian Jewry released a report in 2025 that logged a severe, escalating surge in targeted incidents. And we aren't just talking about online trolling here. The report meticulously documents real-world public harassment, vandalism, slurs being shouted at Jewish business owners, swastikas drawn on public property, and even the intimidation of school children. It paints a very clear picture of a sustained, calculated campaign designed to spread fear and basically disrupt social cohesion.
Which brings us to Part 2, the legal loophole.
Now you might be wondering, why couldn't the police just arrest them on the spot? Well, law enforcement was essentially trapped, paralyzed really, between two pieces of legislation. On one hand, you had the Crimes Act. That required prosecutors to prove the suspect was intentionally inciting violence. That is an incredibly high legal bar to clear in court. On the other hand, you had the Summary Offences Act, which covered offensive conduct in public.
Groups like the National Socialist Network knew exactly what they were doing. They deliberately orchestrated their rallies to fall perfectly into the gray area right between these two laws. The actions were deeply offensive, sure, but they carefully stopped just short of explicitly inciting physical violence.
Let me give you a prime example of this loophole in action, because it really shows why authorities were getting so frustrated. In October 2025, Thomas Sewell, he's a prominent figure in the National Socialist Network, faced court over a white supremacist march in Ballarat. In court, he successfully argued that his conduct, while obviously controversial, was actually political and not offensive under the law. And the magistrate actually found him not guilty, stating the police just hadn't proven their case. Because forms of hate speech like microaggressions, belittling, and intimidation usually fail to meet those strict criminal thresholds, extremists were basically able to exploit these legal gaps with near impunity.
So, how did the government respond? Let's look at part 3, the legislative crackdown.
The political response built up incredibly fast. Starting back in late 2023, Victoria specifically banned the public display of the Roman salute after extremists used it to intimidate passengers on a train in Melbourne. Fast forward to right after that shocking November 2025 rally at the NSW Parliament we talked about, and the state rapidly introduced a Crimes and Summary Offences Amendment Bill. Then, by early 2026, the federal government stepped in with a massive piece of legislation, the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate, and Extremism Act. And finally, using these sweeping new powers, the government officially designated the National Socialist Network a banned hate group in May of 2026.
So, what actually changed under the hood of the law? The new federal rules are incredibly specific. Publicly displaying prohibited Nazi symbols, things like the Hakenkreuz or the double Sigrun, or performing the Nazi salute, is now a straight-up criminal offense. But here is the real legal game changer. Prosecutors no longer need to prove a suspect explicitly knew the symbol was banned. The new standard is simply recklessness. If a person is aware that there's a substantial risk the symbol is prohibited and they go ahead and display it anyway, that is sufficient for a criminal conviction. It completely lowers the bar for law enforcement to intervene.
But of course, sweeping laws like this don't happen in a vacuum. Part 4, the free speech debate. This shift creates a massive core tension. On one side, you have the government and community groups arguing pretty forcefully that they have a fundamental duty to eradicate hate groups and protect citizens from targeted intimidation and psychological harm. But on the flip side, constitutional experts in the legal community are raising some serious red flags. You see, Australia doesn't have a formal Bill of Rights, but it does have an implied freedom of political communication built right into its constitution. Legal experts are warning that using ambiguous terms like hatred, which really relies on an impressionistic feeling rather than hard, empirical assessment, risks legally mischaracterizing nonviolent political or even religious discourse.
And this perspective is heavily backed by civil liberties advocates. Actually, Electronic Frontiers Australia summed it up perfectly regarding previous hate speech rulings. They said, when encountering racist or hateful speech, the best remedy to be applied is generally more speech, not enforced silence. The big fear here is that suppressing this content, just driving it underground, doesn't actually eliminate the underlying ideology. Instead, it might create this perception that the speaker is some sort of forbidden martyr, which could massively increase interest in ideas that would normally just be marginal and rejected by society.
Which leads us perfectly into our final section, Part 5, the constitutional clash.
$157,000. That is the astonishing amount of money former members of the banned National Socialist Network quickly raised through crowdfunding. And get this, the donations were pouring in from across Australia, the US, and the UK. So they aren't just taking this ban lying down. They are taking this massive war chest and using it to mount a direct, high-stakes legal challenge against the federal government in court. Their argument? They claim that these new laws operate as a doorway to tyranny and blatantly violate their constitutional freedoms.
So it all boils down to this profound question. As Australia pioneers some of the absolute strictest anti-extremism laws in the Western world, we have to ask ourselves, do these sweeping bans actually permanently eliminate extremism by cutting off its oxygen? Or do they risk eroding the very democratic freedoms of speech and association that they are ultimately designed to protect? It's a delicate, incredibly high-stakes legal balancing act, and the courts are about to decide exactly where that line is drawn. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning. The common law of England in respect of outlawry had no force or effect in this colony. It would have been impossible to have a man declared an outlaw here by the common law process of England. Okay, think about those words for a second. That's Justice Simpson from the New South Wales Supreme Court back in 1900. It's a quote that perfectly and kind of terrifyingly captures a really dark reality of Australia's past. Out in the colonial bush, the traditional rules of justice, they simply didn't apply. If the state decided they wanted you, they could strip away literally every legal right you had, making it entirely legal for anyone to just shoot you on sight.
Right, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking the historical and, honestly, the ongoing tension between state authority and individual rights in Australia. It's basically a story of a pendulum constantly swinging back and forth. On one side, you have the government's perceived need to maintain order at any cost, and on the other, the fundamental civil liberties of the people they're actually supposed to protect. It's a wild, fascinating, and tragically real journey.
To figure out how we got here, we're going to follow a pretty clear roadmap today. 1. The Age of Outlaws. 2. Creating the Bushranger myth. 3. Police powers and corruption. 4. Tragedies of wrongful convictions. And finally, 5. The push for reform. Let's kick things off in the 1800s. Section 1. The Age of Outlaws and the Felons Apprehension Acts.
This was an era where colonial governments genuinely felt they were losing their grip on the sprawling, untamed countryside. So how did they respond? With an absolute iron fist. In 1865, New South Wales passed the Felons Apprehension Act. See, under normal common law, a police officer couldn't just shoot a suspect. They had to actively call on them to surrender, and lethal force was strictly a last resort if they resisted. But against heavily armed bushrangers, that put the police at a massive disadvantage. So the government's solution was just to draft new laws that completely stripped accused individuals of their legal protections. Victoria did the exact same thing in 1878. If you were declared an outlaw under these acts, you could be killed on sight by anyone, civilian or police, with zero legal consequences. And in 1900, the Supreme Court officially validated this brutal approach in the case of R. v. Jimmy Governor. To put the sheer scale of the state's response into perspective, just think about the number 2,000. When Jimmy and Joe Governor, two Aboriginal men who had been entirely pushed to the fringes of society, fled into the bush, the state's reaction was essentially a full-scale military operation. They mobilized a massive 14-week manhunt made up of 2,000 police, troops, and armed civilians to track down just 2 men. It's still one of the largest manhunts in the continent's history, and it really highlights the overwhelming, almost unbelievable force the colonial state was willing to unleash.
But here's the thing about overwhelming force. It almost always has an unintended side effect. And that brings us to Section 2, Creating the Bushranger Myth, Folk Heroes versus State Enemies.
This era creating a massive, fascinating disconnect. On one hand, you have the government view. They saw these men as violent felons, the ultimate enemies of the state, who needed to be wiped out using those shoot-on-sight laws. But then you have the public view. Lots of working-class colonists were feeling completely trapped by petty regulations and corrupt local authorities themselves, so they actually sympathized with the outlaws. They saw figures like Ned Kelly or Jimmy Governor as anti-authoritarian rebels, in some cases as indigenous defiers of white colonialism. To the public, these guys weren't just criminals, they were cultural folk heroes fighting back against a totally rigged system.
And this cultural obsession actually made cinematic history. The 1906 movie, The Story of the Kelly Gang, is widely recognized as the world's very first full-length narrative feature film. It ran for over an hour, and it was a massive commercial hit. But because it romanticized Ned Kelly's exploits and showed the gang acting chivalrously, authorities absolutely panicked. They saw it as a glorification of criminality that was basically going to inspire rebellion. So the government stepped in and actually banned the film in Kelly Country, regional areas in Victoria, and eventually banned bushranger films altogether across multiple states. Even in art, the state had to maintain absolute control.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. As we move into the mid to late 20th century, that frontier mentality of absolute state power didn't disappear, it just morphed. Welcome to Section 3, Police Powers and Corruption, Royal Commissions, and the Thin Blue Line.
The justice system during this period was wrestling with a huge philosophical dilemma, and it's perfectly summed up by this quote from the landmark 1989 Fitzgerald Inquiry in Queensland. It reads, "Honest citizens can be protected from criminals only by the state, which may itself entail the exercise of powers which themselves involve some intrusion upon individual rights." It's an incredibly delicate balancing act, right? Yes, police need special powers to fight serious crime, but every time you grant those powers, you risk eroding civil liberties. And history shows us, time and time again, that when that power goes unchecked, the results are an absolute disaster.
And when that balance completely fails, the fallout is massive. The history of major inquiries proves it. The Fitzgerald inquiry in '89 exposed corruption so deep in Queensland that the police commissioner himself actually went to jail. Then in '97, the Wood Royal Commission in New South Wales uncovered systemic evidence fabrication and the institutional protection of pedophiles. Fast forward to 2004. Operation Florida exposed armed squads literally stealing drugs and taking bribes. The recurring theme here? That thin blue line mentality. It's this dangerous belief among some officers that they are the exception to the rule, and that catching criminals justifies breaking the law to do it.
But listen, this ends justify the means culture. It's not just some abstract legal problem. It has a devastating, real-world human cost. Which brings us to Section 4, Tragedies of Wrongful Convictions, when the system fails.
When an adversarial justice system decides that winning the case is more important than finding the truth, innocent people lose their lives to a prison cell. Take 1980. Lindy Chamberlain was convicted of murdering her baby daughter, driven by an intense media frenzy and totally flawed forensic evidence, despite her absolutely insisting from day one that a dingo took her child. It took 8 excruciating years for her to be exonerated. Or look at 1994, when Andrew Mullard was wrongfully convicted of murder based on withheld evidence and blatant police misconduct. He spent almost 12 years in a maximum security prison before the High Court finally stepped in and quashed his conviction.
And perhaps one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in modern history was built entirely on a flawed scientific theory. Have you ever heard of Meadows' Law? It is wild. It was this deeply flawed, now fully discredited reasoning that if a single family suffers more than 3 sudden infant deaths, it automatically has to be considered murder until proven otherwise. There was zero physical medical evidence of smothering, yet this exact logic was used in 2003 to convict Kathleen Folbig of killing her 4 children. The legal system essentially decided that a tragic coincidence was a crime.
It took an unprecedented global scientific effort to fight that flawed assumption. 27. That is the number of eminent global scientists who had to band together to publish a groundbreaking paper. They proved that a super-rare genetic mutation, the CALM2 variant, carried by the Folbig girls, was a highly likely natural cause for their sudden cardiac deaths. This massive scientific breakthrough eventually rallied over 150 experts, finally leading to Folbig being unconditionally pardoned in 2023, after spending 2 decades behind bars for a crime she did not commit.
So the crucial takeaway we need to grasp here is that these tragedies are rarely just isolated mistakes. They are symptoms of systemic failure. The root causes of wrongful convictions are recurring institutional defects, inaccurate science, tunnel vision by prosecutors who are desperate for a win, outright police misconduct, and the grim reality that these forces overwhelmingly target the vulnerable and socioeconomically disadvantaged. The system, as it stands today, is incredibly resistant to correcting itself once it sets its sights on you.
Which leads us finally to Section 5, the push for reform, ensuring the future of justice.
Because the traditional appeal system fails so often to catch its own mistakes, legal experts, we're talking former High Court justices here, are actively calling for the creation of an independent criminal cases review commission in New South Wales. The whole idea is to have an independent body solely dedicated to actively investigating miscarriages of justice, rather than leaving the impossible burden entirely on the wrongfully convicted. From the shoot-on-sight outlaw laws of the 1800s, right through to the systemic failures of modern forensic science, the pendulum of justice in Australia has swung wildly. And as we look at this modern push for independent reform to actually protect the vulnerable, we are left to ask ourselves a vital question. Is this the end of an era or the start of a new one? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning.